You are Steve Jobs. The year is 1985. You are 30 years old. The company you built from a garage has just removed you, and it did not do it quietly. The board voted unanimously. The CEO you personally recruited gave the speech. Your name is on the front page of every business newspaper in the country, and the story they have decided on is simple. Steve Jobs is finished. There is a building on the outer edge of Apple's campus that employees call Siberia. You have an office there now. No direct reports, no product responsibilities, no meetings on your calendar. You drive in, sit alone for 3 or 4 hours, then drive home in the middle of the afternoon. Some days you do not go in at all. Nobody notices either way. You have roughly $100 million from selling your Apple stock. You kept one share deliberately so you could still attend the annual shareholder meetings. And you have a question that does not have an obvious answer. What do you do now? This is September 1985. The question is not abstract. The pressure is not primarily financial. You are rich by any honest measure. What has been stripped away is something money cannot replace. For 9 years, every morning, you woke up as the person running Apple. Now, you wake up as the person Apple fired. The distance between those two identities is where you currently live. It is a long distance. Here is what should genuinely concern you, and it is not the public humiliation. The personality traits that built Apple are the exact traits that got you removed. The relentless perfectionism. The ability to pull work from engineers and designers that exceeded anything they believed they could produce. The absolute refusal to compromise on your vision, even when the people around you had data and you had instinct. The board did not remove you in spite of these qualities. They removed you because of them. If you go build something new, you bring those same instincts with you. Every one of them. And you have no evidence, not a single data point, that you can do anything differently. So before you decide anything, you need to understand exactly how you arrived in this room. The Macintosh had failed in a specific public way, the kind where you told the world an exact number and delivered a fraction of it. You predicted 500,000 units in the first year. The real number was roughly 50,000. Unsold machines were filling warehouses. Apple posted its first quarterly loss in company history, then laid off 1,200 employees. More than 1 in 5 people. Gone. You and John Sculley disagreed completely on how to respond. Your position? Cut the Mac's price aggressively and advertise. Sculley's position? The Mac was technically underpowered and cannibalizing Apple II revenue, the one product still keeping the company solvent, would push Apple into insolvency. Neither of you was willing to move, so you decided to solve the disagreement a different way. In May, while Sculley was traveling to China, you moved to take control of the company. You tried to recruit a senior executive named Jean-Louis Gasset to your side. Gasset called Sculley within the hour. Sculley canceled the trip. He came back. He walked into the boardroom and gave the directors one choice: back him or find a new CEO. They backed him. Every vote. That was 4 months ago. Since then, you have been unmoored in a way that is hard to describe to anyone who has not experienced it. You flew to Europe with your girlfriend, Tina Redze. You wandered through Paris, and the two of you had real conversations, not theoretical ones, about emigrating permanently, buying farmland in the French countryside, building a different kind of life entirely. You also had extended conversations with your Zen teacher, Kobunchino Otogawa, about retreating to a Heiji temple in Japan, the central monastery of Soto Zen Buddhism, and taking vows. Not as a figure of speech, as a plan. You made apology calls you did not expect to be making at 30. You sat down with David Packard, who co-founded Hewlett-Packard, with Bob Noyce, who co-invented the integrated circuit. You told them you were sorry, that the previous generation had trusted you with something, and you had not been able to hold it. Now look at what is actually in front of you. Option 1. Start a new computer company from scratch. You have the money, the name, and a group of talented engineers at Apple who have already told you they would follow you out. Over the past few weeks, a specific product idea has been forming that will not leave you alone. A Stanford biochemistry professor named Paul Berg, a Nobel laureate, described the problem of teaching laboratory science to students who study the equipment in textbooks and diagrams but can never afford to put their hands on the real instruments. When you asked why they did not simulate those experiments on a computer, Berg's face told you everything. He had not thought of it because the machine that could do it at a price universities could afford did not exist. A powerful, elegant workstation built for higher education and research. Three benchmarks that engineers at the time called the 3M machine. A megabyte of RAM, a megapixel display, a megaflop of processing power. The idea has been crystallizing for weeks, but you have never built a company from the foundation without Steve Wozniak carrying the technical architecture. Your management style has only ever existed inside Apple's infrastructure, and the moment you announce, Apple will treat you as a competitor. Option 2. Acquire or invest in existing technology companies. You have been watching a computer graphics division at Lucasfilm that George Lucas wants to sell to fund a divorce settlement. You could buy it, but you are not a financier. You are a builder. The idea of owning something and not redesigning it from the ground up is close to intolerable. Option 3. Venture capital or advisory work. Half of Silicon Valley is former operators who transitioned to coaching and funding the next wave. You have the capital and the connections. You also know yourself well enough to know that this option is the worst of all. Not because it is undignified, but because watching other people build things would feel like watching someone else live your life. Option 4. Genuine time away. The monastery, France, years of travel and study and distance from the pressure to prove anything to anyone. You are 30 years old and you are more depleted than you have ever been. Some of the worst decisions you made at Apple came from a kind of mania that long rest might actually have addressed, but the industry will not pause while you recover. 3 or 4 years out of the game and you may not be able to get back in. Option 5. Find a way back to Apple. You told Playboy magazine earlier this year that the thread of your life and the thread of Apple would always weave together. You believed it when you said it, but the board just voted unanimously against you. You have sold your stock, and you have no allies left in the building. Any attempt to re-enter would be treated as destabilizing and dealt with accordingly. Option 6. Leave technology entirely. Education, design, philanthropy, biology. Your interests outside of computers are genuine and wide. But when someone asked you recently what you actually wanted, your answer was not ambiguous. You said, I want to build things. If there is no place for me to make things, then I will do what I did twice before. I will make my own place. Now think about what each of these requires you to give up. If you start a new company, you step directly into the argument your worst critics are already making, without Wozniak's engineering, without Apple's money and infrastructure, without anyone in the room willing to tell you when your perfectionism has crossed from useful to destructive. If it fails, the story sets in place and does not move. Steve Jobs was a product of circumstances he did not create. He got lucky once. Every dollar you invest increases the exposure and makes the story harder to escape. If you retreat, you protect what is left of your health and your money. The narrative tightens around you as you go. He ran. If you try to return to Apple, you face near certain public humiliation. The board has already made this decision in writing unanimously. And underneath all of it is a trade-off that no one around you will say directly. You could live on $100 million for the rest of your life without working another day. That option exists. The version of you that needs to prove something to the world is the same version that got you fired. You have no new information about whether you have changed. Whether that drive saves you this time or destroys you depends on something you cannot measure from the inside. Stop here. You are 30 years old, rich and humiliated and untethered from everything that defined you. 6 different paths. Which one? What Jobs actually did was determined, in the end, by 2 things that happened in the same week. The first was the lunch with Paul Berg, which moved the workstation idea from a vague instinct to something with actual shape. Berg described students whose entire laboratory education was conducted through photographs of equipment they could not afford to touch. When Jobs kept pressing on the simulation angle, Berg's excitement was the confirmation Jobs needed. The need was real. Nobody was meeting it. Jobs drove away with the outline of a product. The second was a final meeting with Apple's board. Jobs asked, in what turned out to be his last attempt to stay connected to the company, whether he could found a small internal research division. A few people, a few $1 million a year, working on what came next. The board said no. There was simply no place for that. The last door closed. On September 12, 1985, Jobs walked into the Apple boardroom and resigned. He said he planned to start a new computer company with a handful of low-level employees, targeting the education market, not competing with Apple in any area that mattered. The board was initially receptive. Some members talked about Apple potentially investing. Then Jobs named the specific people he wanted to bring. The room changed. Apple filed suit against him within weeks. 5 days later, he filed incorporation papers. The name he chose was Next, not subtle about what it meant. And almost as a secondary move, he pursued the Lucasfilm graphics division he had been watching. In February 1986, he bought it for $10 million. $5 million in technology rights, $5 million in startup capital. He made himself chairman. The team was led by a computer scientist named Ed Catmull. Almost no one outside a small circle of researchers knew the group existed. They called themselves Pixar. Here is where the narrative people know diverges from what actually happened. Next produced a machine that was technologically extraordinary. A matte black magnesium cube running an operating system years ahead of anything on the market. It also cost $6,500 when the original target had been $3,500, with peripherals often well over $10,000. Universities, the intended customers, could not afford it. Next sold roughly 50,000 machines across its entire production run. The company lost between $40 and $66 million every year it was in the hardware business. In 1993, Jobs shut the hardware division down and laid off more than half the staff. The operating system, Next Step, was another matter. A researcher named Tim Berners-Lee used a Next machine to create the World Wide Web. The first browser and the first web server were both built on Jobs' failed hardware. That fact passed through the industry at the time as a footnote. Nobody was paying attention to what it meant. Pixar was worse for longer. The hardware products sold fewer than 300 units. Jobs poured $50 to $60 million of his own money into the company across nearly a decade. He tried repeatedly to sell it. He approached Paul Allen, the co-founder of Microsoft. He approached Hallmark Cards. He wrote multiple business plans specifically calibrated to attract a buyer who would pay $50 million, the exact break-even number, just enough to exit without declaring public failure. Nobody bought. People who were close to the situation at the time have said they believed Jobs was approaching genuine personal financial distress, not in the vicinity of bankruptcy as a metaphor, as a real possibility. Toy Story opened on November 22, 1995. Pixar went public 1 week later. The yuan stock was priced at $22 per share. By the end of the first day of trading, it stood at $49. Jobs owned 80% of the company. He became a billionaire in a single afternoon. He called Larry Ellison. His first words, "Hello, Larry? I made it." Within a year, Apple came for Next. The company was losing $1 billion annually, 90 days from running out of cash, and their internal project to build a modern operating system had collapsed. Sitting there, fully functional, running on a failed hardware platform was Next Step. Apple paid $429 million. Jobs returned as an advisor, then interim CEO, then took over. Next Step became Mac OS X, then iOS, the iPhone, the iPad, the Apple Watch. All of it built on the software architecture of a company that could not sell its own computer. If Jobs had chosen the monastery, the farm in France, anything other than going back to building, Apple would have needed a different operating system. The most plausible candidate was B Inc., led by Jean-Louis Gasset, the same executive who had walked Scully back to the boardroom in 1985. Apple without Jobs attached to the acquisition was, in most credible analyses, Apple on a continued path toward irrelevance. But do not read this as evidence that Jobs knew what he was doing. He tried to sell Pixar to a greeting card company. His primary venture bled money every single year it existed. The technology that saved Apple was produced inside a company whose main product the market declined to purchase. The man who returned to Apple as a billionaire with leverage to demand the terms he wanted was, a year before that call to Larry Ellison, a man who was trying to find any buyer who would take a company off his hands for a break-even price. The decision Jobs made in September 1985 was not a vision. It was not a plan. It was a man who could not tolerate the only alternative. He chose next, because not choosing it meant accepting a version of himself he was not capable of living with. Most people who make that kind of decision are wrong about themselves. The belief that you are fundamentally a builder, someone for whom the work is the only thing, is common. The people for whom it is actually true are rare. And there is no reliable way to know which category you are in before you bet everything on the answer. Jobs happened to be right. The technology from his failed hardware company became the architecture of the World Wide Web. The company he could not sell became $1 billion in a single afternoon. The operating system that universities could not afford became the foundation of every device Apple has made for the last 30 years. All of it came out of a decision he could not have defended rationally in September 1985. He was right about what he was. That turned out to be enough. But he did not know that when he made the choice. He just knew he could not stop.